Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. You've just come at a time when some of our commissioners have been asked to go back to Parliament. So it's us four, so we haven't got MPs for this particular session, but we are filming it, and it will be tweeted about, and there will be a transcript of this conversation which will appear in the annex of our final report, which is a report from the Commission. It will be made clear in that report that you are acting independently, that you don't necessarily endorse Bright Blue's vision or Bright Blue's policy, so just to make that clear for you. So this is obviously Bright Blue's Conservatism and Human Rights project, the oral evidence session day. We're looking at a variety of themes for the whole project, including what you're talking about here, which is women's rights abroad and preventing sexual violence and conflict, which we know the government, particularly under William Hague's premiership of the FCO, was particularly keen on. So we want to explore a little bit more in detail some of the progress around that, or the lack of progress, if that may be the case. So just to say, the commissioners sat here today. We have Nigel Fletcher, who's our head of research, myself, Ryan Shorthouse, I'm the director of Bright Blue, Kate Maltby, who's an associate fellow at Bright Blue, and James Dobson, who's a researcher at Bright Blue. So very bright blue, as you can see. And it would be great if you could start by just introducing yourselves in terms of who you are and telling us a little bit about your organisation. So Dorcas.
So I'm currently the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Programs at ActionAid. I've just recently returned from ActionAid, having worked for the International Rescue Committee as a Women's Protection and Empowerment Technical Advisor covering the Middle East. And I was in charge of our response to the refugee crisis in Europe, and also worked in Iraq with doing safe space programming for Yazidi women and other women who were women refugees. And then before that, I was working at the Poppy Project, which supports victims of trafficking in the UK. So doing legal advocacy, safe house programming as well. And then before that, I was working for ActionAid as head of programs in Tanzania and head of advocacy in the UK, where we met all those years ago. So ActionAid works in 45 countries around the world. They are known for their women's rights work. In the conflict area, what ActionAid has pioneered are two different kinds of models of programming. So one is around women's leadership. So the humanitarian sector is woefully inadequate around acknowledging the role of women around peace processes, but also their leadership when it comes to emergencies, around when it comes to conflict. So ActionAid has been trying over the past 5 years to try and develop a program modality that looks at women's leadership in communities during big crises and how to recover, which is something the humanitarian sector still grapples with. So we do very well on women's protection. So we do very well on creating safe spaces. So some of the leadership that you talked about in terms of William Hague's programming, when that translates into funding in the ground, it normally translates into safe space programming. So that means you make sure you have a safe space women can go to where they can receive certain services and support to recover from high levels of sexual violence. There's a disconnect between that and when women recover and become active in the peace process in their country, where they are often not visible, and also where women's own resilience in their own communities about what works for them. So the humanitarian sector hasn't been great at doing that, but there's a shift now towards more localization, more working with women's rights groups. So ActionAid brings that model to the table and asks the humanitarian sector, what are you doing around women's leadership in these crises? Another model of programming that's becoming that ActionAid pioneered around 17 years ago was around access to justice. So that was also the missing piece. So we help women recover. We realize that they are blind. There's gender blindness in terms of the peace processes. But there is no redress in terms of justice, in terms of what's happened to them. And one of the highest types of violence against women. It's often not around armed groups per se. It's around intimate partner violence during an emergency. That's also quite an unexplored area, even though that's one of the key modalities. So ActionAid would always work. It pioneered this way of working with the nosiest women that you could find in a community. So it would train these nosy women, quite strong women, into community paralegals. So then they would, so if you have a case where you're in a crisis and your dad wants to marry you off, which often happens, lots of trafficking happens because for your own safety, said nosy woman would be the one who would interfere. Said nosy woman would be the one who would take you to the police if you've been raped and make sure that the police collect forensic evidence in order to make you to get the justice you need. And said woman would stop you being married off by different chiefs in the village. So that was a pioneered project that was normally in conflict states in Eastern Africa, and we took it to Afghanistan to great effect. So that is more than 3 minutes, I think, but I hope you've got a flavor of what ActionAid does.
Great, thank you. So I'm an academic at King's College London. I'm a reader in gender and development. So I teach in the area of gender and development, and my research is on gender and social policy in Latin America, mainly in Peru. The last 10 years or so, I've been working specifically on sexual violence in conflict in the Peruvian context, and how that relates to the post-conflict process and transitional justice processes in Peru. Now, in order to talk about one country, you need to understand the context in which that happens, and in how particular case studies relate to case studies elsewhere, and how that relates to global policy. So some of the main conclusions of my work in that area around sexual violence in the conflict in Peru is that it's not only widespread in conflict but also in peacetime. And I think that to confirm what Dorcas is saying about domestic violence in situations of crisis, not only so domestic violence generally tends to increase during conflicts, but a lot of sexual violence perpetrated by armed groups from whatever side is not necessarily strategic or ordered explicitly as a strategy of war. Most of the violence, sexual violence or violence against women, is part of practices that are pre-existing and that escalate or exacerbate during conflict because of the breakdown of social order, because of possibilities, also because of the production and the reproduction of hierarchies. And that can be not only about hierarchies between armed groups and their so-called enemies, but also within armed groups. So a lot of the violence that happens, that armed groups perpetrate, are actually messages within the group to reproduce hierarchies between soldiers, for example, or between men within a community, or between men and women, or between men and boys. So a lot of sexual violence are used as a tool to forge hierarchies within any given situation. And that is, of course, very similar to what happens in peacetime. And if I'm talking about peacetime violence, then I'm talking about very high levels of sexual violence against minors, girls under 18, against boys under 18, in houses, in households, in families, in communities. And I'm talking about Peru, but also about Latin America more broadly. And the same patterns we see in other countries and regions of the world. One of the other things is that a lot of the work that has been done recently in global policy, including by the UK, however interesting and useful and necessary it seems, it has not led to a reduction of sexual violence in conflict. And I think that the violence that we see currently in Syria and Iraq, the violence of ISIS against Yazidi women, for example, is a very good and explicit example of how a global policy against sexual violence is not at all working as a deterrent. Likewise, the ICC action to forge accountability, to prosecute, is not working as a deterrent. On the contrary. So again, that leads me to a further conclusion that perhaps to eradicate sexual violence or to end sexual violence in conflict, one might need to stop conflict, as the obvious. Nevertheless, even if that was so, then we're still not ending sexual violence, because it will continue and it's there in our societies, and not only in Peru or in Iraq or in Syria, but very much here as well. So I guess that one of my main conclusions of the work that I've done is that in order to look or to talk about sexual violence in conflict, we need to look at sexual violence or more broadly gender-based violence in post-conflict situations as well as in any other context.
Okay, thank you. Very, very, very helpful. You talked about there being no reduction in sexual violence in conflict. Is there data on that? How do you know that equivocally?
No. There is very little data, of course, but there is also very little. Okay, so let's rephrase. Good point. Rephrase. There is no evidence that sexual violence in conflict is being reduced because of the global policy. There's no evidence on the contrary either. If there is evidence, then it seems that sexual violence is actually increasing. But that might be because we are now all watching, and we weren't watching before. So even if it seems to be increasing, that's not necessarily evidence either. It's the whole problem with data and evidence around sexual violence is that it's underreported, completely underreported for the reasons of stigma, secrecy, shame and embarrassment among both perpetrators and victims. So it's very difficult to find trustworthy data on any of this.
Do you agree with that, Dorcas?
To an extent, but because I do think it is difficult, and for ethical reasons, the World Health Organization, for example, has really strong guidelines around how you collect research data on this. But I do want to give greater credence to the British government around its leadership. So beyond the Foreign Office, DFID has been doing a series called What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. So one of the really experimental and radical projects under that is a project called Compass, which I used to manage for IRC. And it was a very brave £10 million investment with Columbia University to do a randomized control trial and a program in 3 countries, in DRC, Pakistan, and Ethiopia, to see if prevention of violence against adolescent girls in 3 humanitarian settings is possible. So producing this data, so producing the baseline in terms of like the amounts of prevalence, which is always difficult, and they used all sorts of amazing tablet technology, apart from in Pakistan, where it was very difficult to collect this kind of data. And they tested the theory of change that women's groups have been saying for a long time, that you have to look at this as an attitudinal problem. This is an exasperation during a conflict, but these are underlying things that conflict exasperate rather than create. You have to look at services. So, even though when there are services, the mindset of certain service providers exasperate violence. So you have to look at that. You also have to have the evidence based on what works. So I don't think that any single policy, in so much as it's aimed at bringing awareness of violence against women in conflict is going to end it, because that's bigger than anything that British government could ever do. Yes. But what I don't want to leave here is the impression that the leadership that the British government has shown on this issue, and how they battered it through the UN, how they battered it across different donors and took leadership of it, that has been very, very helpful to women's rights organizations who for years have been working on the fringes of this issue and trying to get heard. And it has resulted in investment in response services. So that's brilliant. You know, there are more response services. Now we're in a different kind of world, and we have an interesting leadership in America, and America was starting to follow Britain's lead on these issues. The Scandinavians were starting to follow Britain's leads on these issues. So it was no longer acceptable, for example, even though this is an international standard, to say, okay, when we have a humanitarian response, our first thing is to make sure that we make some tents, that there's some tents, that we secure a refugee camp and go forward. You had to look through a gendered way. You had to say, if I put the tent here, women are more likely to get raped. And this is something that we've been saying for years, but British leadership made that practical, made that happen, and other donors were starting to follow. The fear is, we hope that this wasn't just a passing fad. You know, so I don't think it's quite unfair. It's almost, as you were implying, and I was saying, more colonial language. You need a mind bomb in people's attitudes, in terms of men's attitudes to women, to actually stop sexual violence. But the British government can only control so much of that, and it can lead the world in doing that. But that's the change that happens when women's groups are well funded, when countries like Britain are willing to stand up and say this is unacceptable. But it's a long-term change. But in response work, I think DFID in particular has shown great leadership, and long may it continue.
Okay, very useful to hear. Any questions from the other commissioners?
Could I just ask, in terms of human rights, we've seen suggestions that since William Hague left office, there's been a kind of deprioritisation of human rights. Does this apply to violence against women since Philip Hammond and now Boris Johnson replaced William Hague? Has the issue fallen from the headline, or is it still being strongly pursued by the British government?
Well, this is, since Brexit, this is a very new administration, and I would put forward that the government has been preoccupied around the Brexit negotiations. So to give you a straight answer, I don't know.
And Philip Hammond was
to give you a straight answer, I don't know. Or to give you a better answer in terms of, so ActionAid really supports women's rights groups, and we've been running a campaign for a while called Fearless, which is against our self-interest as a big INGO. We believe that the most effective way of solving a lot of these issues is to invest in small women's rights organizations. And we've seen this administration hear that message. We saw that in the current civil society review that was released by DFID. But the levels of bureaucracy for women's rights organizations to actually access that funding is still too high. So we were a little bit disappointed that there hasn't yet been progress made on that particular issue. And that was our first test, as it were, around the human rights agenda of this government. So it's very early days. What we have seen is Theresa May's big interest in modern day slavery take shape in terms of the funding modalities. So you know that DFID is getting more consonance of this issue, and that leadership is welcome, because it has been a blind spot for some humanitarian programming. But in terms of the baskets, they are quite small. Maybe it's because there's a sense that they need to test approaches. So I'm not just being diplomatic. I'm just saying that we're in waiting. But we would be very concerned if, given current world events, if Britain vacated that very, very progressive stance that they've taken around women's rights. At the moment, we haven't seen any indications that they would do so, but I haven't really seen any indications that they're plowing full ahead either.
Okay. Nigel?
Yeah, I mean, following on from that, I mean, obviously the British government has made it in the past, and as you were talking about whether or not that's continued is perhaps still open, a high priority. I just wondered if there isn't any evidence of whether it's increasing or declining internationally, whether there is any evidence of it being taken more seriously by governments overseas.
Oh yes.
Yes, I would absolutely confirm that. It certainly is taken more seriously. I think that the effect of support for small organizations, but also of governments, of specific governments, which is also written up in the report that you all received, is a clear indication that some governments are definitely taking it more seriously, at least on paper. And what that then means in the long term is in practice is a different issue, I think, but we can't judge that as yet.
And I would say that the mood music has changed. So humanitarian work used to be very machismo. It's the sort of thing that guys like to talk about in the pub. I've just come back from Iraq. Look at how tough I am. There is a more gendered discussion. There is a more serious technical discussion around addressing these issues. So you've also seen a variety of different kinds of actors, try and come in and address this issue. So I think the British government has succeeded in terms of putting it on the global agenda. I think where we still lack is the rhetoric and the finances to actually address this issue. There is a big mismatch. So often you would hear a complaint from other humanitarian actors who work in different parts of technicalities. So like maybe in WASH, which is water and sanitation, saying, well, violence against women and girls has taken the big global agenda. And it's true. So you hear a lot of mood music, but when you break down the money, it's still chronically underinvested. And it's very expensive to help women recover. There are lots of people who do very good advocacy and campaigning work on women's rights, or do lots of amazing research on women's rights. But you would be hard pushed to find people who have the technicality to actually respond to a group of women who've been violently raped and help them recover. And that's where I have a problem. So the British government put this on the agenda, and then lots of very interested people came in and saw a career paths for themselves in terms of policy advocacy, but hard cash in terms of actually helping women to recover. I think Britain is still the only strong donor in leading that, and maybe CEDA, to be fair. And the Canadian CEDA is coming on stream as well on that. But Britain still is a big leader in terms of hard cash, in terms of testing approaches. So rather than just saying this works, they're actually putting a lot of money into research to see what they can do to prevent it.
And is this funding coming primarily from DFID, or is it a mix of FCO and DFID?
It's primarily from DFID, who hold the humanitarian portfolio.
And could you just go a little bit further into what you think the reasons are for Britain, what the circumstances are in Britain that have allowed it to make that change in the world, and whether that can be replicated? Sure,
and maybe this, I don't know how you perceive this, but Bright Blue, being part of civil society, would understand this. As in both Conservative and Labour administrations, the women's sector got together and put this on the agenda. So we're very grateful for the leadership shown by William Hague and Angela Jolie and the rest. But women's rights defenders in the UK have been in coalition with other women's rights groups in conflict states for a long time, fighting on this issue for almost 30 years. So then ActionAid's own contribution in it was to produce a theory of change to DFID. So, saying this is an issue is one thing, but what is the theory of change? So ActionAid produced that theory of change. And then DFID is testing it with other organizations who have certain levels of technicality. But this only came because there was a strong civil society push for it. I wouldn't say that suddenly, these issues gained their ascendancy just because this was always on the agenda. Women had to put it there, and they still have to put it there. And every day they're fighting to put it there. And I think what I saw in Iraq and what I saw in the caucus with women's rights organizations who are trying to respond to the biggest humanitarian crisis of our time is also the gender blindness of that as well. The sense that, you know, these women's stories aren't being told as they pass through Europe, because often our images of male refugees passing through, no one knows about the kind of torture, sexual torture that they're going through all the transit routes. So I think, again, it's women's groups who will bring that to the agenda. And we're very happy that it fell to receptive ears, because clearly in other countries there are other women's groups who are doing the same, but other governments have not taken the same level of leadership. So it was a nice coincidence, but it was a long time coming, and they are not going away.
And is that also about empowering pre-existing immigrant communities and women within immigrant communities in Britain? Is that an issue elsewhere in, you know, other comparable European countries, or is it not particularly coming from that sector?
Is what an issue?
Is it coming from the diaspora community? I think it's a mix of both. So there are some migrant women's groups who are phenomenal.
I've encountered some, that's why I asked.
Yes, yeah, there are some, but they are really chronically underfunded. If you look at the Association of Women in Development, which, if you like, is the trade union of women's rights organizations globally, they'll say that the average income of these groups is $20,000, which is very limited when you think of, you know, a typical gender-based violence response should be at least minimum 5 million. So, you know, the modalities in which you need to operate are really restricted. So that means that their voice and visibility is also reduced. So we have a problem with that in the humanitarian sector, particularly as ActionAid. We're really trying to advance the voices of women who know how to support these kind of women to be more visible in terms of the kind of modalities of aid that we give. And of course, there are nerves in the British government around tracing, around accountability, around value for money. And often these organizations are so small that the levels of compliance that are needed to access DFID funding or FCO funding are too high for them to do so. But I think we need to be a little bit braver, because actually smaller and more contextual is more effective.
Okay, so just to finish off, I'd like to ask what more government and DFID and FCO can and should be doing to support this. Obviously, there's a positive story, which is Britain is taking a lead on it. And it worked with civic society and has been quite strong in shaping international opinion on it. But what more now needs to be done? I think you alluded, Dorcas, to funding. Other than that, what are the other things that you'd like the British government to be doing in this area?
Strong leadership. I don't think they should vacate that space. It's much more than ever needed. We don't know yet what the new American administration will take on this issue, for example, but we were aware that the British government was working quite closely with the Americans around keeping this on the global agenda, and that's really important, because US aid and State Department aid is quite instrumental in a lot of humanitarian responses. So having the Americans on board on this is really important. And we know that Theresa May and Priti Patel have said that they are committed to keeping this on the agenda. We would like to really see how far that they go with that. That global leadership, I think there's a nervousness that will withdraw given other expedient issues that the government may want to focus on. So there's a big tension there. It's not just funding with a small women's rights organization. It's an acknowledgement that actually they have the best solutions. So that's a shift in program modality. It's it's to ask that the bigger humanitarian organizations, the bigger INGOs, the social enterprises and businesses that were trying to bring a more technocratic approach to some of these issues, take that kind of local knowledge into account, because it's more effective and sustainable. So it's not just keeping them alive through funding, but actually respecting the perspective that they have to bring.
I second it absolutely, and these are very important points. One additional point to make, although I very much recognize the British government's leadership in putting or in addressing sexual violence in conflict. This has been long in the making, not only by civil society groups but globally as well. So in that sense, it also draws on other years, 20 years of research on activism within the UN and beyond the UN, and so on. So this is something more broadly. There's a lot of interest in and attention to sexual violence in conflict specifically. Now, while I think that's very important, and I hope that we can keep some of the attention on sexual violence in conflict. I think that in order to, in the end sexual violence in conflict, we need to keep also addressing gender-based violence more broadly. And that means not only looking abroad, but also looking at the UK. That means domestic violence services within the UK. It means looking at refugees and asylum seekers within the UK and in Europe. It means looking with a gender lens, much more broad, at a broader range of violences and at different places, not only elsewhere but also here. That's the only way the UK can actually be an example in the world as well as a leader.
Okay, thank you very much. Very useful, very rich and useful discussion. So the Commission is going into a policy formulation stage now. So please do stay in touch, feed us more ideas and resources, and the Commission will be coming out with a final report perhaps in springtime. So this has been incredibly useful. So thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Sure. Thank you.